So our next talk is going to be with Dr. Amanda Bachmann on pest management in diversified vegetable systems. Dr. Bachmann is a pesticide education and urban entomology field specialist with SDSU Extension and is based in Pierre, South Dakota. She has a PhD in entomology from Penn State, and her responsibilities include providing pesticide safety education and training for commercial and private applicators in South Dakota. She works not only with traditional urban pests like bedbugs and mosquitoes, but also urban pollinators and other beneficial insects.
All right, thank you. It sounds like the mic is working. Awesome. Thank you for that introduction. Happy to be here. Super excited to do local presentations. It's a really short commute from across the river. But yeah, I'm going to be talking about pest management in diversified vegetable systems. So I am originally from Pennsylvania. I've actually been out in South Dakota for 10 years now. I moved here before it was cool. And Pennsylvania I grew up in like zone 6. We could grow pretty much anything except for citrus. I did my PhD research in cucurbits, on pests of cucurbits. I worked in snap beans. I did some field trials on sweet corn. I cannot carve a pumpkin again to this day because I spent too much time with butternut squash. And then I moved to South Dakota and it was like, oh wow, it's actually hard to grow some stuff out here because there's no moisture. That was a real big limiting factor. Pennsylvania, trees are weeds. It's just, green everywhere. I moved to South Dakota in 2013, so it was after the 2012, it was after the flood, after the drought, and everyone was like, why are my trees dead? It's like, well, did you water them? No. So I learned a lot about the different gardening challenges and production challenges out here in South Dakota pretty quickly in my first year. But just a show of hands, I'm assuming since everyone's here at this conference, are you all growing, vegetables in some capacity for a fresh market? Cool. I also do a lot of pesticide education, so I go through like the categories and I'm like, if you're in the wrong category, like now's your chance to escape and go to another room. Like you thought I was going to be talking about pigs, now's your chance to run. No shame. I've been in the wrong room before too. But yeah, vegetables, the things that we have at farmers markets, we have a ton of different crops. We have crops where we are selling the fruit, we're selling the leaves, lots of different sort of like time scales as far as when they're ready, if you've got determinate tomatoes versus indeterminate. So just a lot of variability, which also means a lot of opportunities for pest pressure. So just like feel free to shout out what are some of the biggest pests that you've been dealing with in your vegetable production.
Potato bugs.
Potato bugs?
Chipmunks.
Aphids.
Chipmunks, okay. Aphids? On what crop? Everything?
Cucumbers.
Okay, interesting.
Greenhouse production.
Okay, aphids in greenhouses, yep. Yeah, chipmunks. I actually haven't seen a chipmunk in Pierre, South Dakota. We've got the 13-line ground squirrels here. I kind of miss chipmunks. We had groundhogs in Pennsylvania, which were a much larger, real big vertebrate pest issue. And also, since my background is entomology, I will be focusing a lot on insect pests. However, I do end up fielding a lot of questions about things with backbones and, other things. We do have a lot of great SDSU specialists that are more on like the plant pathology side of things, the plant diseases, and then we also have a new specialist for weeds. So hopefully we'll get some of our weed stuff out there more. But the concepts that I'm going to talk about can be applied to sort of all of the different kinds of pests that we're dealing with, but a lot of my case studies are going to focus on insects. I spent a lot of time with aphids in grad school, so they are one of my favorite insects, and there's a lot of ways to kill them, so that's okay. But yeah, so lots of pest pressure. Also, if anyone's ever grown in a community garden situation, you have sort of some very similar issues in the fact that you've got lots of garden neighbors, and they might not all have the same levels of tolerance for pest pressure. They might not have the same management practices as you do, and so you get a lot of pests sort of coming into your plot that then you have to manage. When I gardened in Pennsylvania at a community garden, potato bugs were atrocious. We just stopped growing potatoes, which, if that's part of your sort of market portfolio is not necessarily, the greatest option. So also with some of these products, we have a low tolerance for damage. Pennsylvania, big apple state, surprisingly. I know getting closer to the Rocky Mountains, we think Washington's where all the apples come from, but I was, blessed to have like a research farm full of apples at Penn State that we could play around with. And for a fresh market, the consumer wants that like nice, perfect apple. In some cases, that attitude is shifting, especially with market gardens, CSAs, that kind of thing, where people are speaking directly to the food producer and starting to understand more of the process of food production. But generally in the grocery store, people are looking for that perfect piece of fruit or that perfect pumpkin. So we can have, a lower tolerance for damage in these systems. And we also have short pre-harvest intervals. For some of our crops, there's not a big window between when that crop is ready to go and like its shelf life. So think about anybody here grow raspberries for any sort of production? Having any issues with spotted winged Drosophila?
My biggest challenge last year was just too hot.
Yep, yeah.
Just couldn't stay.
Yeah, and for some of these crops, climate, and I do have a slide about some climate resources too, but climate can just be a big limiting factor here. But with things like raspberries and some of our other soft fruits, we do have spotted winged Drosophila, which is an introduced pest that's been in South Dakota for about 10 years now. And you almost don't even know that you have that because it's inside the fruit, and it's like when you go to pick it, the fruit just disintegrates. And it also reduces the shelf life.
Is that little white worm?
Yes, it's like it's a fly, so the larvae are maggots. They're, inside. That's a fun one. There's been a lot of work out of the sort of berry states, Pacific Northwest and also Minnesota on that one. Because again, trying to manage that with some sort of insecticide, you apply it, but then you have to wait X number of days before you can sort of legally and safely harvest that fruit for sale or consumption. And sometimes that window means the crop will be spoiled before you can get it, off the vine or in front of a consumer. So that can be tricky with some of our sort of even more specialty crops. But so how do we handle these kinds of challenges? So really, this talk is a sneaky way to tell you all about integrated pest management, which honestly is probably something that you may already be practicing. You just might not have put like the words or the term to it. So knowing about integrated pest management will also help you sort of identify some more resources that can help you with different steps of the process. But it's really just about combining sort of all of our management tactics, so everything from what you're choosing to plant, when you're choosing to plant it, to any sort of inputs that you're putting onto it, be that maybe nutrients, pesticides, row cover, putting it all together to help to solve your pest problems. So putting your knowledge and your skills together to come up with a plan for pest management. I'm going to go through these steps, and if at any point you have questions, because we have like plenty of time together today, I am kind of keeping an eye on it, so we've got some time for questions too. But if you have questions during any part of this, feel free to raise your hand, and we can have some like discussion during the presentation. I really enjoy talking to like vegetable producers because you guys are a lot more engaging than commercial applicators who just sit there and stare at me like a bunch of dead fish. So please ask me questions. I love it. That's why I work in Extension. It's a new question every day. But we're going to go through pest identification. That is really honestly one of the most important steps is actually knowing what you're dealing with so that you can properly treat it. The number of times I have people that are like, I sprayed this insecticide, and it turns out that they were dealing with like a fungus. It will save you time and money if you know exactly what you're dealing with. Record keeping, not just for pesticide applications, actually useful for other parts of your operation as well. Management recommendations, prevention and exclusion, there are absolutely things that you can do at the beginning and the end of the season to help to cut down on some of your pest numbers the next year. And really utilizing multiple management strategies. So there's not one silver bullet that is going to solve every pest issue for every person in every crop. I get a lot of questions from homeowners that are like, how do I deal with these like picture wing flies that are just sort of flying around? And it's like, dude, if I had the super magic bullet, like I would be rich and I would not be working for Extension anymore. Like if I could tell you how to get rid of bed bugs, in one easy step, I would not be here right now. But that solution doesn't exist. And it also sadly doesn't exist for the pests that we're dealing with out in our environment. Because really, we're growing crops in an ecosystem. And sometimes like the members of that ecosystem are gonna come hang out in, say, our zucchini. And then the last step is reassessing the effect of what you did. So going back to that record keeping, making observations, seeing what worked, seeing what didn't work, and then adjusting your strategy for the next year. Because also our growing conditions never seem to be the same year to year. Last year was super hot and dry. Who knows what the heck this summer is gonna be like. We're gonna be starting off this spring with a lot of moisture coming from our various snowpacks, depending on where you are in the state, but who knows what's gonna happen after that. So monitoring for problems. Anyone out there use yellow sticky cards in their operation? You folks with the greenhouses use sticky cards at all? Sticky cards? Yeah, sticky cards are great. They are so scouting options, you can be passive or you can be active. Passive is the sort of set it up and then go back and check it later. Active is where you're taking a net or something out and doing the actual physical sampling yourself. Passive is great for if you've got maybe a large area, greenhouse situation, put those traps out, where they are, go back to them in 3 to 4 days or a week or whatever sort of your monitoring interval is for the pests you're dealing with. They are not selective, so anything that flies into them will stick generally. There are some more robust insects, some of the larger beetles that can manage to wiggle their way off. Even striped cucumber beetles I have watched extract themselves from the tanglefoot and make it off. But for the most part, it gives you a pretty decent sample of what's moving around in your field. There are also traps out there. If you are dealing with, I spent a lot of time in sweet corn, and the caterpillars that you get in sweet corn, those actually, the adult version is a moth. You can put a pheromone in a cone, wire trap, and it will attract the moths. And you can then count the moths, see what your numbers are, see if your numbers are increasing or decreasing, and plan your management accordingly. So anybody out there dealing with squash vine borers? Yeah, there's a pheromone trap for those. So squash vine borers, and the pheromones tend to be for things like the moths that are, sort of using that chemical communication to find mates. And for something like a squash vine borer, where you have a very short window for chemical management, because essentially once that egg hatches, the larva moves into the stem where it's protected. So you've got a real short window where you can possibly do an application to kill any of those caterpillars before they burrow in. But the moths, you might not actually see the adult moth. And so using a pheromone trap, you can start to trap and be like, okay, I now have squash vine borer activity. It's time to start scouting or wrapping stems in aluminum foil or, whatever. So the pheromone traps like that can be a great way to have an idea of when pest activity is starting in your area, because that can also be really variable. Insect development is dependent on temperature, and different insects sort of develop faster than others, and have different sort of temperature requirements for coming out of hibernation over the winter or completing their development in the spring. So not everything starts flying at the same time, which is kind of nice. But yeah, there's a lot of trapping options out there, and depending on your sort of pest du jour, there might be some really specific things available. And then active scouting, this is where, how many people have an insect net with a canvas bag or a sweep net at, in your greenhouse, in your operation, have a net anywhere on your property? Okay, you should all go get a net. I should have brought one as a visual. But if you have, especially for trying to get counts of things like maybe grasshoppers, or if you have any pasture area or any sort of cover crops or field crops that you're trying to maybe catch some insects out of and see what you have, a sweep net is a really great tool to have in your arsenal. You can do the sweeps, and then you just dump the bag into a gallon plastic zip top container or a 5-gallon bucket. You can kind of see what you have and then either let stuff go or like throw it in the freezer or, you know, feed it to the chickens. So we also have, especially for our field crops, we have sort of like pest thresholds. So, you know, you go through, if you're sweeping alfalfa, like we've got the numbers for like, if you see this many alfalfa weevils, this is a treatment threshold. We don't necessarily have those thresholds for a lot of our different vegetable crops, but it's something that we can definitely work on, especially now that we have a much more robust horticulture team at SDSU. Raise your hand. Like we've been hiring new people in horticulture and it's very exciting. But yeah, SweepNet is another great tool to have out there. And active sampling for things like diseases, just going out, walking your fields, flipping over leaves, checking your crops on a periodic basis to see if there's anything funky happening. I mean, how many people sort of know when powdery mildew hits their cucumbers or their squash? Yeah, like you start to see the leaves turning. And honestly, some of those squash diseases, it's like, well, this is just helping, you know, keep a reasonable number of squash versus like flooding the market. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff to do for monitoring. And if you're out already like doing some weed management, you know, checking on irrigation lines, like you're already out there in the field. It's just adding those steps of checking for or making notes about what insects or diseases or other things, you know, just add that step and, you know, and add those to your journal. So yeah, capturing things, putting them into like essentially a Ziploc bag, great way. You just empty the SweepNet into the bag, see what you got. Traps, you know, stuff gets sort of like in a bucket for you to sort of look at. And it can sometimes be challenge mode, like to see what you've got. Totally put like traps or stuff in the freezer. That will either slow down or kill the insects that are in there, because again, development is temperature dependent. So if you freeze them, that's an easy way to knock them out or dispatch them, and they're still in really good shape, so you can do the identification or you can send the samples in if you need help figuring out what you've got. A lot of times people are like, oh, I tried to take a picture of this, but it kept moving or whatever. I'm like, put it in the freezer. It will stop moving, and then you can get a really nice picture. Because everybody at this point, you know, has a phone in their pocket with like a gazillion cameras on it, and you can get a really good picture, you know, of an insect. Plants are a little, you know, less likely to run away on you, but if it's windy outside, you know. But yeah, send us a nice, clear, in-focus picture. Freeze the sample, you know, send it in to us. We're happy to help with identification so that you can diagnose your problem, so that you know what you're dealing with, so you can choose an appropriate management technique. And this was from, we were doing grasshopper sampling in road ditches and just found some really awesome, I found like a pink katydid. I actually found one praying mantis in like 200 sweeps. So they are out there. It was pretty cool. I'm also like an insect evangelist. I love bugs. So I understand in some situations we do have to kill the bugs, but generally I really enjoy them. So yeah, identification. Identify the body. Take a good picture, send it to us. Have that sample. Anybody have, you know, a favorite like insect like field guide or website that you use all the time? Oh man, okay. There's some great ones out there. One, extension resources. We've got a lot of stuff on our extension website, but for some quick identification of maybe some like funky moth or butterfly that you saw, bugguide.net is a really active, they call themselves an amateur entomology community, but there's a lot of professionals on there as well that like their hobby is just identifying bugs. You can put a picture up there, someone will tell you what it is within an hour usually. So that's a really great resource. And for things like beneficial insects, we do have, I don't have any printed copies in my office at the moment, but we do have some great flip guides that if you see us out at like Dakota Fest or State Fair or some of our other extension meetings, like we should have some more printed copies of stuff this summer. And you can always like shoot one of the authors or myself an email and we'll get one in the mail to you. But yeah, having some identification resources so you can kind of get a feel for what you have, but you're also totally welcome to, you know, phone your friend at SDSU Extension as well. Also for identification, figuring out like what caused the damage. I get a lot of people who will send me a picture of a bug on a tree and they're like, this bug is killing my tree. And it's like, you know, a monarch butterfly or something. And it's like, no, it just happened to land there. Like correlation does not equal causation. This is not what's killing your tree. The fact that your tree is in South Dakota is what's killing your tree. But understanding like what is truly causing the problem is very important. So like identification, honestly, the biggest thing that you can do. Because we also have, abiotic things out there, lack of water, lack of nutrients that can be causing damage and issues. It's not always the fault of something with, multiple cells or backbone or anything like that. And then also figuring out, is it a pathogen? We have the plant diagnostic clinic, so they are able to sort of culture out stuff and figure out what we have, plant disease-wise, so viruses, fungi, bacteria. Because much like you can't use an antibiotic to treat the common cold, you can't use essentially an antibiotic spray to treat like a fungal pathogen, out in your field. So identification, absolutely critical. Has anyone submitted a sample to the plant diagnostic clinic before? Okay, we're gonna get more of those hands raised by this time next year. The diagnostic clinic is actively wanting more people to submit samples to them, and I wanna say it's maybe like $15 for a diagnostic for plant diseases. It's really not a lot. So absolutely great resource to have in the state. And really for the pathogen things that you can't necessarily diagnose off a picture, super important if you've been dealing with plant diseases out there in your field. So yeah, just because an insect's hanging out on your plant doesn't mean it's the thing that was actually causing the damage.
Where would we send them to?
So the plant diagnostic clinic is on campus. I think I've got their website in a slide up here, but yeah, their mailing address is on campus, and they have a form online that you can download and fill out, or any of our regional centers. We also have the forms and the stuff to help you mail a sample in. And I think some of our county offices do too. But yeah, we'll absolutely help you get a sample in. But yeah, so in this case, we've got, 2 insects hanging out in my garden. Is this one gonna be hurting my tomatoes? Anyone know? Correct, because it's an adorable little bee, right? It's one of the pollinators out there just hanging out, taking a rest on my green tomato, not hurting anything. You can see clearly not super great at weed control in my garden, but whatever. How about this guy? How many people have had issues with grasshoppers? It's also really unfortunate because there is no magic bullet for grasshoppers outside of maybe having a cool, wet spring, so a lot of them die when they hatch. But yeah, this is our 2-striped grasshopper. Again, a surprising amount of grasshopper diversity in the state. However, they are generalist herbivores. I don't know that this one was necessarily munching on my kale. It might have been actually cabbage whites, but it was hanging out there looking suspicious. But yeah, for things like grasshoppers, man, because your garden or whatever is usually the last green thing in the landscape. So if the pastures and stuff are really drying out, grasshoppers are going to start moving in, and there's not a ton that we can do about grasshoppers. I should have stolen a picture from Dr. Adam Fahrenhorst, but they had a sunflower trial over at Dakota Lakes, and the grasshoppers moved in and ate everything. It looked like it had been hailed out, but it was grasshoppers. So if you've got chickens really enjoy grasshoppers. This is one area where if you've got a small diversified operation, you can get a little bit creative with how you're managing some of these generalist herbivores like grasshoppers. They're not selective. They're going to eat anything that's out there. And this is one where scouting is important, so you can start to see oh, my number of grasshoppers are increasing. Because if you're going to use a chemical to manage them, you want to do it when the grasshoppers are small. Once they get to this size, nothing is going to touch them except for possibly a nuclear blast or a chicken. So you want to be trying to get these critters when they're a size that you can actually, touch them with your management strategy. But yeah, grasshoppers are, if you've ever been, I handle a lot of insects and sometimes they bite me. And the ones that most routinely draw blood are grasshoppers. They have very strong mandibles. So they also make good fishing bait. That's another way to use them. But yeah, so just because an insect is on a plant doesn't mean it was the cause of your problem. But yeah, talking about identification again, proper ID is critical, but also the life stage matters. So especially for insects, we've got things like our cabbage whites where, the caterpillar obviously is what is causing all the damage and ends up being managed. But if you start seeing like a bunch of the white, Pierre butterflies flying around, you're like, oh no, I should be, definitely make sure that I'm checking my kale. And they can also be, eating very different things. So you think about, the caterpillar life stage has to get a lot of energy into its body in order to turn into a butterfly. So that's what's going to be sort of feeding on the foliage of a lot of our plants. But then once it's in the butterfly stage, it's great. Everybody loves them. But yeah, so depending on the life stage, also depending on the organism, might have very different treatments that you need to be taking care of. And then, use the resources that you have. Like Extension, we've got our, 9 regional centers and main campus across the state. We've got our county offices, which can be maybe a closer point of contact to help get your question sort of to the people who can answer it. But yeah, use us, your tax dollars pay for our existence. So use us as a resource. We are out there, we love getting questions. It's like solving a different murder mystery every day as far as what's going on, wrong in, somebody's crop or whatever, and helping to come up with a solution. So, but yeah, ID is really that keystone step, because if you don't have a proper identification, you might just end up throwing money at a problem and then not, getting any result because you've been using a completely sort of inappropriate control method. But yeah, list of resources. Right now, one of the fastest ways to get a question in front of all of the horticulture team is our Ask Extension widget. It's on our Problems and Solutions page, and it's kind of at the bottom of the page, scroll past some information, but you can put in your subject line, the body, and the message. You can upload up to 3 images. So if you've got good, images of the problem, you can send us 3 pictures in your submission. And this will go to essentially our Ask Extension page that most of us have access to, and we'll assign the question as appropriate and try to get it answered as quickly as we can. Also the diagnostic clinic, great resource for sending in physical samples, especially of things that you suspect are plant diseases. We do have garden hotlines across the state. They are currently not staffed, but we're hoping they will be by the start of summer. We usually have those in Aberdeen, Sioux Falls, and Rapid City. We also added Pierre to the list this year, but it kind of just depends on where we get people hired for those part-time positions. So if you know anyone who would want to answer, garden questions part-time for SDSU for, all of the summer, we will have those job postings up really soon. And then I'm here here across the river in Pierre at the regional center. So for arthropods, if you've got a sample, feel free to drop it in the mail to me. I appreciate it if you use a hard-sided container. I did get an envelope once that was just full of beetles that somebody had found in their cabin, and I had to piece the beetles back together to find one that was big enough that I could actually identify. So bug confetti is not great. Please use a hard-sided container. Yeah, because envelopes go through a mail sorter, things get squished, it just gets messy. I also appreciate it if the sample is already dead. I did receive a sample of carpenter ants one time, and they were in a mason jar, but they just had saran wrap over the top. I looked at them, was like, oh, yep, carpenter ants, and then went and did something else. Next day, I noticed that they had chewed their way out of the saran wrap. So dead samples in a hard-sided container, very much appreciated. I love getting funky bugs to identify. So yeah, so once you know what you have, it's all about using multiple management strategies. Sometimes, especially with home gardeners, they sort of shoot first and ask questions later. So they'll be like, yeah, I just, doused my garden in 7. And it's cool, that was actually, white mold, or, it wasn't an insect at all. What are you doing? So use sort of everything that you've got in your toolbox. Chemical control is there, but it's the last step, because it's also the one that critters can develop the most resistance to. So we also want to make sure that we're rotating our management strategies so that we're not selecting for the super aphid that's resistant to every insecticide. Looking at you, soybean aphids. But yeah, so cultural and physical control, things like row covers, mowing, planting time. Biological control, we've got a lot of insects out there that eat other insects, so that can be helpful. mechanical control, mowing, tillage in some cases, and then obviously the chemical control, which is sort of the step of pest management that most people think of first. Sometimes people don't think of these other things as being part of the pest management process, but they really are still key components of integrated pest management. And also a note that organic pesticides are still pesticides. So in the state of South Dakota, if you are a producer producing ag commodities valued at over $1,000, you do need a private applicator certification if you are doing, if you are applying any sort of pesticides to your operation, be they general use or restricted use. You definitely can't get them if they're restricted use and you don't have a license. So one thing that I have noticed in sort of the diversified production audience is like, this is my group that maybe more people need to have their private applicator certification. Anyone in this room already have their private applicator certification? Got a couple? Good job, guys. But yeah, the private applicator certification, state of South Dakota, it is free, and the certification is good for 3 years. So we currently have one more Zoom on April 6th where you can just watch us for 3 hours and get your card. And we also have an online course and an online exam. All of those options are free, but I do want to make sure that folks that are producing ag commodities valued at over $1,000, that you are making sure that you're in compliance with those South Dakota laws and regulations. Because I'm not the regulatory agency, so you can definitely ask me questions. I'm not going to send an ag inspector your way. I don't work for them, but I do want to make sure that if they are in your county doing spot checks, that it doesn't turn up that you actually did need to be certified. So if you've got questions about that, that's like one entire half of my job. I'm happy to answer more of those questions afterwards. But yeah, prevention, planting resistant varieties. I was gardening in Pennsylvania when late blight blew through all the tomatoes, and we had hardly any late blight resistant tomatoes, and it was just the tomato apocalypse. After that, we ended up getting some more late blight resistant varieties that were on the market. And we absolutely, even in our community garden situation, started planting them because it was just so devastating to have all of the tomatoes go down. So depending on the diseases that you're seeing, especially, resistant varieties might be a good choice at the start of the season. Changing your planting time. That's one that I think some people, you're trying to, get that sweet corn by the 4th of July or that first tomato at the farmer's market. But for some things, if you can be the one that maybe plants a little bit later, some of the pests will go hang out with your neighbors instead of finding you first. This is especially true with pumpkins and the squash pests. So how many people have squash bugs? Yeah, I spent a lot of time with them in grad school in organic systems, and it's like there's nothing will kill them. But they overwinter as adults. So if you've got black plastic or weed cloth, if you're planting into the same sort of covered area year to year, those squash bugs are totally going to be overwintering underneath that row cover or underneath that black plastic. And then as soon as you put a new curcurbit in there, they're like, oh, hey, cool. I just have to go 2 inches and I'm home. So you do, sanitation, super important. But if you are sort of the last person to plant squash and you're putting them in a new area, they may have found somewhere else to be before your squash is even doing anything useful. You can also utilize trap crops, so putting in some sacrificial blue Hubbard to sort of suck all the squash bugs there and then nuking that to within an inch of its life. But yeah, phenology, the timing of biological events, sometimes you can use that to your advantage. And then also understanding treatments that are preventative versus treatments that are curative. This is especially important if you're dealing with tree fruit production, anyone growing apples, pears, anything like that. If you don't already read John Ball's Tree Pest Alert, absolutely start. He's got great information, especially on those tree fruits, but for some of the diseases that can impact that fruit production, you've got to be applying the fungicides that are preventative, at certain stages of flowering, because you're trying to essentially prevent the fungus from penetrating the fruit versus things that are curative that are going to be trying to kill the disease that's already taken hold. So timing for preventative versus curative is super important. And yeah, I should have put his Tree Pest Alert on the list of resources, but wealth of information there. It's not super searchable, but it is a good read. And keep records. We have some great climate tools available. If you go to climate.sdstate.edu, that's our mesonet, and they are going to be expanding and putting stations in more places over the coming year or two. They got a bunch of federal funding to expand the mesonet. But there are tools on the climate page and degree days. So if you have a certain pest and you want to know sort of where it is in its development, you can check out that degree day tool and sort of see, how many degree days have accumulated in my area, and should I be, on the lookout for, say, squash vine borer flight yet? So that can be a super useful tool. And if you're somebody who is doing doing the pesticide application, there's also a spray tool that will give you the wind speed, inversion conditions, all that fun stuff. So highly recommend, if you haven't used the mesonet page before, to take a look at it. And yeah, it can be used for record keeping as well, as far as those wind speed and temperature records for Department of Ag pesticide records. But yeah, it's a very, very handy resource. It does not come in an app form. It is just a website. Turns out that apps are really expensive to develop. And then you've got Android versus Apple, and then every time an OS updates, you got to update your app. So it is just a web-based tool, and probably will be for the foreseeable future. How much time do we have? Yeah, I've got some time. So what to do with pesticides? Use them according to their label directions. Please read and follow that label. If the crop that you are wanting to control, say, black grass bug on or whatever, is not listed on that pesticide label, odds are good that you actually shouldn't be putting that pesticide on that crop. So please, the label is the law. Read and follow the label directions. If you need help interpreting label directions, that's part of my job, is helping people, get through those things that the EPA approved that companies wrote. Also store them according to their label directions. I am totally guilty of having some really funky Roundup that I inherited with my house. That's just been in the garage for, at this point, 10 years, going through a freeze-thaw cycle. Don't be me. At least it's just Roundup and not DDT or something really bonkers. But if you are using chemicals in your operation, do make sure that you are storing them appropriately. Also, hot tip, use secondary containment. So if you've got things of the same sort of kind, put them together in a bin so that if they do leak, they're sort of contained in one area versus suddenly being all over the shop floor. Also, store them in their original containers. Resist the urge to buy in bulk and then repackage into smaller containers. Don't do that. That's how people end up getting poisoned. So keep the product with its original label. This also counts for organic products. Anything that's got an EPA registration number, you got to be keeping it in its original container. And then disposal, that's also on the label, but in the state of South Dakota, we do have a container recycling program through the Department of Ag. They'll go around to every county about once per summer and pick up containers for recycling. They do have to be rinsed and empty, but they will recycle your pesticide containers. So I know a lot of times it's our bigger ag operators that are taking advantage of that, but it is available to anybody in South Dakota. They also have an unusable pesticide collection program. So if you do have stuff in the shop that you're it's been years since we've used this, we're not using this product in our operation anymore, Department of Ag will collect that. You can either set up an appointment to, I think, bring it here to Pierre or to Vermilion. So kind of geographically distinct areas, but it is a good way to dispose of unusable chemicals. Because we don't have a ton, unless you're really in the Sioux Falls area, we don't have a lot of household hazardous waste disposal in the state of South Dakota. So if you've got some stuff languishing in a shed, Department of Ag has some good resources to help you safely dispose of it. But moving into some case studies with pictures of some of the tragedies that have happened in various gardens that I've done. So aphids. I personally really love aphids. They have a fascinating life cycle. I have a tattoo of a soybean aphid. I can talk about aphids for a full hour. They were a large part of my dissertation. I love them. They're great. Yeah, I was in grad school when soybean aphids sort of like started, so I did a lot of the monitoring for them in Pennsylvania as people were developing like that 250 soybean aphid per plant economic threshold. So you've got aphids, but you go out, you're scouting, you know, look at all those shed aphid skeletons, you've got a huge population, but you're also seeing things like this little dude. Anyone know what that is? Yep, this is a ladybug larva. I love when people are like, why are these tiny little alligators in my garden? What are they? Because a lot of people aren't used to like beetle larvae being so like mobile or even like recognizing that that's what they are. Because beetles go through complete metamorphosis, so they look totally different than the adult ladybug. So yeah, ladybug larva loves to eat aphids. This little green tube here, anyone know what that one is? That one's a little bit trickier, not quite as common. That is actually a syrphid fly larva. So you know those hover flies or flower flies that, you know, look like a bee, but they can actually like precision fly? Their larvae are actually predators. So this is essentially like a maggot that is a carnivore. And it goes around and eats aphids too. So if you're out there scouting and you've got aphids, but you also have a bunch of natural enemies, so these things that are going to be eating aphids for you, depending on your crop, and especially if it's out like in a field, greenhouse situations are a little bit different. But if you've got these natural enemies outside, you know, you may want to consider like not using an insecticide, because an insecticide, a lot of them are very broad spectrum and they're going to kill these guys as well as your aphids. Aphids, though, have asexual reproduction, so they are going to bounce back a whole heck of a lot faster than your natural enemies. So that is one of the balances of figuring out, you know, how much damage can you tolerate? Because really, some plants can tank a lot of aphid damage. Aphids are phloem feeders. They're sucking out the saps. They're not doing a ton of necessarily like physical damage to the outside of the plant. They also like being on the growing points. So they're going to be on sort of the new leafy growth versus say like feeding directly on a zucchini. But yeah, and in greenhouses, if you've got like a totally enclosed system, you can actually release natural enemies indoors to help keep aphids and some of those other like white flies and things under control. So you might not ever get to a zero pest population, but you can keep them in balance with having some of their predators roaming around as well. Oh yeah, these guys are friends. You can see like my hand for scale. Zucchini, even with pest pressure, sometimes zucchini are like, whatever, I'm fine. But in a smaller sort of home garden situation, you can do a lot of scouting for egg masses and just sort of like physically destroying the egg masses. But if you have huge, you know, acres of pumpkins or something, you're really not going to be able to put that level of, you know, effort into, you know, destroying the eggs before they get big. With squash bugs, much like with grasshoppers, you want to kill them or try to kill them when they're small. Once they get to this stage, it's really hard to make them die. Because much like our aphids, same order, these are in our hemipterans or our true bugs, but they have that piercing, sucking mouth part, which means that any sort of like dust or something that is applied to the plant, they're actually not going to be taking up really a whole lot that's on the surface of the plant because they're feeding on the plant sap. Since, you know, we're selling, you know, zucchinis for people to eat, we can't really use a systemic insecticide. You know, that would be a great way to kill these guys, but then it also makes your fruit, you know, unharvestable. But yeah, because of how they feed, they're not going to be picking up a lot through feeding as far as chemicals. And behavior-wise, has anyone noticed, like when you're scouting for these, that they'll just immediately go underneath the leaf, underneath the row cover? They are very good at hiding. So, you know, doing an application of a contact insecticide that's going to kill them once they get coated with it is also really tricky because you have to essentially do applications, you know, 360 on the plants, and these guys are some real escape artists. So yeah, if we had a silver bullet for how to manage squash bugs, we would again also be very rich and probably wouldn't be working for Extension. But there is sadly no easy solution for these. There has been some great research coming out of Iowa State looking at row covers and squash production. That can be tricky in South Dakota because it's really windy like all of the time. But for physical exclusion, if you're planting, zucchini, summer squash, whatever, put the plants in and immediately put some row cover over it, you can help to essentially keep these insects off of those plants until they get big enough to handle some of the damage. You also then have to figure out pollination once that first female flower is produced. You do want to have either, throw some bumblebees under there or open up the row cover so the plants can get pollinated so you actually get fruit set. But yeah, the cucurbit pests are super challenging and absolutely a multiple management strategy situation. But yeah, I talked about natural enemies. A ladybug adult, a little bit easier to identify. Another syrphid fly. This right down here is a lacewing larva. So that's another great aphid predator. I do not recommend letting a lacewing larva bite you. I still have the scar on my wrist from that one. Everybody who saw it was like, oh my God, was that a spider bite? I'm like, no, it was actually a lacewing. Spiders don't bite people. But that's another rant for another time. But there are a lot of things out there that are going to eat those soft-bodied insects. It's also very fun with lacewings because they'll like stab the aphid and then like hoist it up like a trophy as they suck it dry. You can find a lot of cool things when you're scouting, just saying. Highly recommend it. And then also going to your vertebrate predators, things like chickens. And also, like, if you've got some garter snakes hanging around, like, get cool with the little snakes because they are also insectivorous and will take out some of the grasshoppers and some of those bigger things. Also, get cool with spiders. How many people have run across, like, the giant, like, yellow garden spider hanging out their tomatoes? Those are great. They'll hang out. They'll eat stuff. Habitat, if you've got some areas where you can put in some flowers, perennials, annuals, anything like that, not only is it going to attract pollinators, which you need to get the good fruit set and good yields, they can be kind of a trap crop to suck in some of your pest population, and it can also be a nursery for those natural enemies. That can be a place that is, producing some of those syrphid flies, some of those lacewings. And then I know, Dr. Lang has been doing a lot more with cut flowers. It can also be a way to maybe stick some cut flowers into your operation. So yeah, the LDR of the presentation: how can you solve your pest problems? Decide how much damage you can tolerate. Identify the problem. You're starting with your least toxic option, moving up the scale. So chemical control is going to be the last step because we want to maintain, pest resistance. We want to make sure that we're not overusing some of those tools. And then if you are using chemical control, make sure to read that label and put on the appropriate safety equipment. Just because something is an organically labeled pesticide does not mean that it doesn't have, need to wear gloves or, long pants and closed-toed shoes. It is winter, so I'm actually wearing closed-toed shoes, but I spend most of my summer in chacos, which is possibly why I don't do a lot of pesticide application in my own garden, because I hate shoes. So, this was, anybody in South Dakota have Japanese beetles? Anyone in the southeast corner? Yeah, Japanese beetles. I was super amazed when I moved to South Dakota, and they weren't in Pierre, at least. I went to the SARE, our state coordinator, regional meeting in Des Moines last year, and their research farm, it was just like, oh man, I forgot how bad Japanese beetles can be. So keep an eye out for those. If you're on the I-29 corridor, you may be seeing them sooner rather than later. But yeah, it's one of the perks of being an entomologist. There's always something new out there that's gonna be a pain in the butt for some sort of grower. And we are happy to help out, happy to take questions. This is a milkweed plant with not only aphids, but Japanese beetles. So it was having a bit of a time of it. Sometimes pests don't believe in just having one thing going on. But yeah, happy to answer any questions. Here's my contact information. Again, I am based in Pierre, South Dakota. So you can always mail me samples, shoot me an email. you can try to give me a call, but if I'm not in the office, I won't be there to help you. Email is probably the better way, and just make sure that you get both ends. Otherwise, I will never see it, and you'll wonder why I was so mean and didn't answer your question. But thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions in like our last 7-ish minutes.
What do you do for spider mites?
Ooh, out in a field or in a greenhouse?
Greenhouse.
There are some predatory mite species. So if you get them sort of before the population has exploded, you can think about, incorporating predatory mites into your operation to see if they can keep the numbers low. Otherwise, spider mites are sort of some of our, smaller, softer-bodied critters. So depending on the crop, things like insecticidal soap or horticultural oil can be effective and sort of one of our like softer touch insecticides for them. On cucumbers, yeah, I'd say, have you tried like the soap or the oil? And they just still, yeah. And it's one of those things that any of the control measures, even chemical, aren't necessarily going to get the pests down to 0, which is why, maybe if you hit them with a chemical, get them low, and then maybe think about doing some predators to see if that can help to keep them in check. But yeah, greenhouses, because like you end up making a nice little oasis for once you get some pests introduced. They're like, oh, hey, this is cool. Like there's no predators, there's nothing eating me. Like I've got perfect climate conditions. Like this is great, which obviously not great for you.
What about potato bugs?
Oh man, potato bugs. So those are ones that you absolutely want to get them when they're small, because once they get to the beetle stage, pretty much can't touch them. It's also one that the sort of old version of 7 was carbaryl, and that was very effective on them. However, carbaryl has sort of like, that active ingredient is not as available anymore because it is a very broad spectrum, absolutely nukes pollinators sort of situation. And that's been sort of getting pulled in various places by the manufacturer. So since they are foliage feeders, like any of the products that are coating the leaf and that they're then ingesting will be more effective when the potato bug larvae are small. So it's pretty much just trying to hit them early with a chemical application, because once you've got the big ones, they are not going to be super killable. Or chickens. Or like the chickens, the guineas, like any of the, but then also like you got to balance the like, because chickens will also eat anything too. So there's like, you got to get them out before they do a ton of damage. And then like kind of depending on what stage your potatoes are in, like if the vines are already starting to go down and your tuber production is mostly over, you can, maybe chickens destroying the vegetative growth isn't going to be the worst thing, and you can just, get the bugs nuked that way. But yeah, potato beetles are absolutely tricky. They are little tanks. Like, anyone out there have a favorite insect? I mean, mine are aphids, which is a weird choice.
I like jumping spiders.
Jumping spiders are adorable, and they can absolutely like kind of recognize you, and they'll tilt their little heads. Like they're great. Yeah. I have a whole other presentation that's like the insect evangelism with all of like the pictures of cute bugs that I found. So. Yeah, right? Yeah. That's if you take the Master Gardener course and the Master Naturalist course. That's who gets that presentation.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation.